Why would the world's fastest rising power give away land it nearly went to nuclear war to defend? March 1969, soldiers clash on a frozen island in the Ussuri River. Moscow weighs a nuclear strike on China's Lop Nur. Beijing mobilizes 1.5 million troops across 4,300 kilometers of frontier. Then, between 1994 and 2008, China quietly settles roughly 40,000 square kilometers of that same contested border without firing a shot. That should mean weakness. But China came out stronger. On the morning of March 2, 1969, the Ussuri River froze into a battleground. Chinese soldiers, nearly 900 strong, moved in formation onto Zhenbao Island, a sliver of disputed land claimed by both Beijing and Moscow since the 19th century. Soviet border guards, backed by armored vehicles and artillery, responded in force. By sundown, bodies lay scattered in the snow. Soviet reports counted 32 of their own dead. Chinese sources claimed even higher losses for the Soviets, while their own casualties remained a closely guarded secret. The fighting did not end there. Over the next 2 weeks, fresh Soviet reinforcements crossed the ice. Tanks and mechanized infantry clashed with entrenched Chinese troops. Barrages of artillery lit up the riverbanks. On March 15th, the battle escalated again, with both sides suffering dozens more killed and wounded. Behind the front lines, the scale of mobilization grew staggering. China ordered 1.5 million troops to defensive positions along the entire 4,300 kilometers of border. Soviet divisions in the Far East swelled to over 1 million men. Rail lines strained under the weight of tanks and ammunition. Both capitals quietly prepared for the worst. In Moscow, KGB Chief Yuri Andropov briefed the Politburo on options to neutralize China's nuclear program at Lop Nur. War planners drew up maps for a preemptive strike, one that could have brought nuclear detonations to the deserts of Xinjiang. The world's largest land armies now faced each other, both armed with atomic weapons, neither willing to back down. American diplomats in Moscow picked up rumors of possible escalation and sent urgent cables to Washington, warning that a local skirmish was spiraling toward existential risk. The border, once a line on old Qing and Tsarist maps, had become the trigger for global catastrophe. In the aftermath, the memory of how close both sides came to disaster would shape every calculation that followed. The line that split China from its northern and western neighbors was never as fixed as it looked on a map. For centuries, the frontier had been drawn and redrawn by a tangle of treaties. Nerchinsk in 1689, Kyakhta in 1727, Aigun and Peking in the late 1850s, each one shifting the legal ground beneath the feet of future negotiators. The Qing dynasty's concessions to Russia, often signed under duress, left behind a legacy of ambiguity, river islands whose ownership depended on the shifting course of the water, mountain passes defined by markers long since vanished, and entire valleys mapped with deliberate vagueness. When the People's Republic inherited these borders, it also inherited their contradictions. Republican and communist leaders both claimed the right to restore what had been lost, but the precise extent of those losses was always open to interpretation. Then, in December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved almost overnight. 5 new Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, found themselves in control of thousands of kilometers of frontier that had never been fully demarcated. The old power that once guarded these boundaries with 1 million men was gone. For the first time in over a century, China faced neighbors with weak militaries, empty treasuries, and a desperate need for international recognition. The total area in dispute with these states, stretching from the Tian Shan to the Pamirs, amounted to roughly 40,000 square kilometers, a patchwork of grassland, highland, and riverbank. Chinese strategists recognized a rare opening. The uncertainties left by 19th century treaties could now be resolved on terms that would have been unthinkable under Soviet pressure. The next 14 years would become a window of opportunity, long enough to negotiate, brief enough to act before Central Asia or Russia could recover their leverage. The stage was set for a series of settlements that would look, at first glance, like a retreat from old claims. But the real calculation ran deeper. Legal certainty, a stable frontier, and the freedom to choose where and when to project power. The logic behind these choices would only become clear as the details of each bilateral bargain unfolded. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan each entered the 1990s with new flags and fragile governments, but the land beneath their feet was mapped in Russian and Chinese ink, not their own. The borders they inherited from the Soviet Union were lines drawn by absent powers, often cutting through pastures, river valleys, and mountain passes that neither side had ever fully controlled. For Beijing, these were not just lines on a map. They were reminders of Qing-era losses and the Soviet confrontations that had nearly brought nuclear war. Yet, when the window opened for settlement, China made a series of choices that confounded nationalist expectations. In 1994, China signed a protocol with Kazakhstan that resolved nearly all outstanding disputes. The numbers were precise. Out of roughly 1,700 to 2,000 square kilometers in question, China accepted just 407 square kilometers, about a quarter of its maximal claim. The line shifted eastward. Kazakhstan kept over half the disputed territory, and both sides gained a border they could actually patrol. The agreement was finalized in 1999, with additional protocols in 2002, quietly ironing out the last details. Kyrgyzstan followed a similar path. Negotiations began in 1996, and by 1999, China had accepted 1,270 square kilometers out of up to 1,800 square kilometers under dispute, more than two-thirds of what its own maps had once asserted. The Kyrgyz government, eager for international legitimacy and investment, agreed to the terms. The deal was ratified with little fanfare, the specifics largely absent from domestic headlines in either country. Tajikistan presented the starkest arithmetic. China's historical claim in the Pamirs stretched to 28,000 square kilometers, but the final deal, drafted in 2002 and ratified in 2011, saw China accept just 1,000 square kilometers, less than 4% of what had once been demanded. Tajik leaders declared the settlement a fair compromise. Chinese officials described it as a gesture of goodwill. In reality, the numbers told a story of deliberate restraint. Throughout these negotiations, Chinese diplomats, led by Foreign Minister Qian Qichen, adopted a strategy of quiet resolution. Talks were held behind closed doors with treaty texts released only after signatures were dry. Sensitive maps and figures were kept out of domestic media, and official statements emphasized mutual friendship over territorial arithmetic. Qian later reflected that the real victory was stability, not acreage. A stable frontier, achieved at a fraction of the maximal claim, was worth more than a symbolic map. For the Central Asian states, the calculus was equally pragmatic. Weak armies and empty treasuries left little appetite for confrontation. Legal certainty, international recognition, and a working relationship with China outweighed the allure of holding out for every last kilometer. Each agreement closed a chapter of inherited ambiguity, locking in borders that had once been the stuff of imperial contest. Piece by piece, the puzzle of China's western frontier was being resolved, not with tanks or ultimatums, but with signatures and silence. The final act in this quiet campaign played out not in the mountain passes of Central Asia, but along the longest stretch of China's northern frontier. In 2004, after more than a decade of incremental protocols and technical surveys, China and Russia signed the supplementary agreement on the eastern section of the boundary. The handshake between Jiang Zemin and his Russian counterparts closed a chapter that had haunted both capitals since the days of the Qing and the Tsars. 4 years later, in 2008, the last disputed islands in the Amur and Ussuri rivers were legally transferred, some to China, some to Russia, ending all outstanding claims along 4,300 kilometers of border. Legal closure brought more than the absence of conflict. It created the foundation for a new regional order. In 1996, even before the Russian treaties were finalized, China and its four neighbors, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, formed the Shanghai Five. This group, built on the logic of resolved disputes, committed each member to demilitarize their shared frontiers. 5 years later, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization emerged, expanding the circle to include Uzbekistan and evolving from a border confidence-building mechanism into a broader security and economic forum. What began as a solution to inherited ambiguity became the architecture for multilateral stability across Eurasia. With the border sealed by treaty, the logic of force deployment changed overnight. China no longer needed to station hundreds of thousands of troops along its northern and western periphery. Defense white papers from the early 2000s reveal a profound shift. The People's Liberation Army began reallocating resources away from continental defense toward the sea. The launch of the Type 05B2 guided missile destroyer, first commissioned in the late 1990s and scaled up in the 2000s, signaled a new era. Naval procurement budgets swelled. Shipyards on the coast took precedence over garrisons in the northwest. For the first time since the founding of the People's Republic, maritime power projection became a realistic doctrine, not just an aspiration. This transformation was not accidental. By trading land for certainty, Chinese planners bought the freedom to choose their next strategic direction. The risk of a two-front land war, a scenario that had consumed generations of military planners, faded into the background. The path was cleared for a turn to the Pacific, and a few years later, for the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. The settlements along the steppe and river were not just the end of old disputes, they were the opening move for a new kind of ambition. In strategy, what appears surrendered is sometimes investment. Today, China's once fractured land borders anchor its western flank, freeing bandwidth for maritime ambition. Stability bought with concessions now underwrites projection elsewhere. The lesson endures. In geopolitics, strength is often measured by what you can afford to give away, and when.